The Apache boy spoke perfect English until someone asked him about the scars on his wrists and ankles. The boy appeared on a Tuesday morning like smoke rising from cold ashes. One moment, the trading post stood empty, except for McKenna counting his coins behind the counter, and the next moment there he was, standing by the barrels of flour and beans, quiet as a shadow, with skin the color of desert sand and eyes that seemed to hold too much sky. McKenna looked up from his ledger and nearly dropped his pencil. The boy wore clothes that had once been white, but now carried the dust of long roads. His hair hung straight and black past his shoulders, and his feet were bare except for strips of leather wrapped around them like bandages. But it was his stillness that made McKenna's chest tighten. The boy stood without moving, without fidgeting, without making any sound at all. "Can I help you, son?" McKenna asked, his voice softer than usual. The boy turned his head slowly, as if sound traveled differently through him than through other people. When he spoke, his words came out clear and perfect, like they had been polished smooth by years of careful use. "I need salt," he said, "and maybe some jerky if you have any that isn't too dear." McKenna blinked. The boy's English was better than half the men who came through his doors. No accent, no broken words, nothing to mark him as different except for everything about him that was. "Salt's a penny for a small bag, 3 cents for a large one," McKenna said, reaching under the counter. "Jerky's 5 cents a strip." The boy nodded and reached into a small leather pouch tied around his waist. He pulled out coins that caught the morning light streaming through the dusty windows. Real money, not the token some of the ranch hands try to trade. "Small bag of salt," the boy said. 2 strips of jerky." As McKenna gathered the items, he couldn't stop himself from stealing glances at the boy. There was something about the way he held himself, straight but not stiff, alert but not afraid. Like a wild animal that had learned to walk among people but hadn't forgotten what it meant to be wild. The bell above the door chimed, and Mrs. Henderson shuffled in with her market basket. She stopped short when she saw the boy, her mouth opening slightly before she caught herself and closed it again. She nodded to McKenna and began examining the bolts of cloth in the corner, but her eyes kept drifting back to the boy like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The boy paid for his purchases without counting the change McKenna offered him. He tucked the salt and jerky into his pouch with careful movements, as if each gesture had been practiced until it became prayer. "Much obliged," he said to McKenna, and started toward the door. "Boy," McKenna called after him. "You got a name?" The boy stopped with his hand on the door handle. For a moment, McKenna thought he wouldn't answer. Then he turned halfway back, enough to show his profile against the bright rectangle of the doorway. "Joseph," he said. "Some folks call me Joseph. That your real name?" The boy's fingers tightened on the door handle. "It's the name I answer to." Before McKenna could ask anything else, the boy was gone, leaving only the fading chime of the bell and the smell of dust and something else, something wild and clean, like pine trees and mountain air. Mrs. Henderson set down the bolt of fabric she'd been pretending to examine. "Where do you suppose he came from, Thomas?" McKenna shrugged, but his eyes were still fixed on the door. "Don't know, but he's got money and he pays his debts. That's more than I can say for some." By noon, word had spread through the small town of Clearwater like ripples on a still pond. The Apache boy who spoke perfect English. The strange child with the careful manners and the wild eyes. People found reasons to walk past McKenna's trading post, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Sheriff Coleman heard about the boy while he was eating lunch at Martha's cafe. Martha herself told him, her voice hushed as if she were sharing secrets in church. "Polite as you please," she said, refilling his coffee cup. "But there's something about his eyes, Sheriff. Like he's seen things. Bad things." Coleman nodded and cut another bite of his beef stew. He was a large man with gentle hands and a voice that rarely rose above a whisper. 20 years of keeping peace in a frontier town had taught him that the loudest troubles usually announce themselves, but the quiet ones could break your heart if you weren't careful. That afternoon, he found the boy sitting on the steps of the old church at the edge of town. The building had been abandoned for 3 years, ever since the preacher died, and no replacement had been found. The boy sat in its shadow, eating his jerky slowly and watching the horizon like he was reading a book written in clouds and wind. Coleman approached carefully, his boots crunching on the dry grass. The boy looked up but didn't move, didn't tense or prepare to run. Just watched Coleman with those sky-colored eyes and waited. "Afternoon," Coleman said, settling himself on the steps a respectful distance away. "Mind if I sit?" "It's your town," the boy replied. "Maybe, but it's God's church, and I figure that makes it everybody's." The boy almost smiled at that. "Almost. You the sheriff?" "Coleman. Been wearing the badge here about 15 years now." He took off his hat and sat on the step beside him. "Folks are curious about you." "Folks usually are. That bother you?" The boy considered this, taking another small bite of jerky. "Not much point in being bothered by things you can't change." Coleman studied the boy's profile against the late afternoon light. There was something old in his face, something that didn't belong in someone so young. "You planning on staying in Clearwater long?" "Just passing through." "Where you heading?" The boy turned to look at him then, and Coleman felt something twist in his chest. The boy's eyes held depths that seemed to go down and down, like looking into a well at midnight. "Home," the boy said simply. "Where's home?" The boy's hand moved to his wrist, fingers rubbing against something hidden beneath his sleeve. The gesture was automatic, unconscious, like touching a scar to remember how it felt to be whole. "Haven't figured that out yet," the boy said. Coleman noticed the movement, noticed the way the boy's fingers traced patterns on his wrist like he was reading something written there. Without thinking, he reached out gently and touched the boy's hand. "May I?" The boy went very still. For a long moment, they sat frozen like that, Coleman's weathered fingers barely touching the boy's smaller hand. Then, slowly, the boy pushed back his sleeve. The scars were old but deep, pale lines that circled his wrist like a bracelet made of pain. Coleman felt his breath catch in his throat. He had seen marks like these before, during the war, on prisoners who had been chained for long periods. But this boy couldn't be more than 12 years old. The boy's other hand moved to his opposite wrist, and without being asked, he pushed back that sleeve too. More scars, identical to the first set. And when he bent forward slightly, Coleman could see similar marks around his ankles, just visible above his makeshift moccasins. The silence that fell between them was heavier than the desert air, heavier than the weight of all the words that couldn't be spoken. Coleman stared at the scars and felt something inside him break apart like old wood splitting along the grain. "Jesus," he whispered. The boy pulled his sleeves back down with careful, practiced movements. "His name was Father Benedict," he said quietly. "He said Jesus wanted us to forget we were Indian. He said the chains would help us remember to be grateful." Coleman's hands clenched into fists on his knees. In all his years of keeping peace, he had never felt violence rise in him so pure and clean as it did in that moment. But the boy was watching him with those ancient eyes, and Coleman forced himself to breathe, forced himself to stay still. "How long?" he asked. 3 years. Maybe 4. Time moves different when you're trying not to remember it. The boy stood up, brushing dust from his worn pants. The sun was getting low, painting the abandoned church walls the color of old blood. "I should go," the boy said. "People talk when strangers stay too long in one place." Coleman stood too, his joints protesting the movement. "Where will you sleep tonight?" "I'll find somewhere. The jail's got a clean cell. No lock on it. Just a place to rest if you want it." The boy looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to read something written in Coleman's face. Finally, he shook his head. "Thank you, but I sleep better under sky." He started to walk away, then stopped and turned back. "Sheriff Coleman?" "Yes. Those scars you saw? They're not the worst thing that happened to me in that place. But they're the only thing I can show you that you might understand." Then he was walking away across the dry grass, becoming smaller and smaller until he was just another shadow in the gathering darkness. Coleman stood on the church steps long after the boy had disappeared, staring at the horizon and wondering what kind of world could put chains on a child and call it holy work. As the first stars appeared in the desert sky, Coleman realized that tomorrow he would have to make a choice he had been avoiding for 20 years. Some things he was beginning to understand were more important than keeping the peace. Coleman didn't sleep that night. He sat on his porch, watching the stars wheel overhead and thinking about chains on a child's wrists. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those pale scars circling the boy's skin like accusations written in flesh. At dawn, he walked to the old church, half hoping and half fearing he would find the boy there. But the steps were empty except for morning shadows, and the only tracks in the dust belonged to jackrabbits and prairie dogs. He found the boy instead by the creek that ran behind McKenna's place, sitting on a fallen cottonwood with his feet in the slow-moving water. The boy looked up when Coleman approached, but didn't seem surprised to see him. "Water's cold," the boy said, wiggling his toes in the current. "Feels good on the cuts." Coleman looked down and saw that the boy's feet were worse than he'd thought. The makeshift moccasins lay beside him on the log, and his feet showed the damage of long walking on hard ground. Blisters had formed and burst and formed again. Some had started to fester. "Jesus, boy, you need medicine for those. They'll heal." The boy's voice carried no complaint, just the flat acceptance of someone who had learned that pain was just another fact, like weather or hunger. Coleman sat down on the log beside him, careful not to crowd the boy's space. "What's your real name?" The boy was quiet for so long that Coleman thought he wouldn't answer. Then, so softly it was almost lost in the sound of moving water, he said, "Nailnish. That's Apache. Means he works hard. My grandmother gave it to me when I learned to make fire with sticks." The boy's fingers moved to his wrist again, that unconscious gesture Coleman was beginning to recognize. "But I haven't been Nailnish for a long time." "How long you been walking?" "Since the snow melted. Maybe longer." Nailnish pulled his feet from the water and began to examine a particularly bad blister on his heel. "I walk mostly at night. Easier to hide." "Hide from whom?" The boy looked at him with those two old eyes. "You really want to know?" Coleman nodded, though something in his chest warned him that some knowledge changed you, made you responsible in ways you hadn't asked for. Nailnish was quiet again, watching the water flow over the rocks. When he spoke, his voice was distant, like he was telling someone else's story. "The soldiers came in the fall. I was 8, maybe 9. They said all the children had to go to school, had to learn to be civilized. They said it was the law." He picked up a small stone and threw it into the creek, watching the ripples spread. "My mother tried to hide me in the root cellar, but they had Apache scouts with them. Men who had forgotten how to be Apache." Coleman felt anger building in his chest again, hot and clean. "They took you by force?" "My mother fought them. So did my father. The soldiers said they could make it easy or hard, but the law was the law." Nailnish threw another stone, this one harder. "They put chains on all of us children. Said it was to keep us from running back to the blanket." "The blanket?" "That's what they called it. Being Indian. They said we had to kill the Indian in us to save the man." The words hung in the morning air like smoke. Coleman had heard about the government schools, had read about them in newspapers from back east. The articles always talked about civilizing the savage, about giving Indian children chance at a better life. They never mentioned chains. "How many children?" 47 on my train. Some were as young as 5. The little ones cried for their mothers until the guards hit them enough times that they learned to cry quietly. Coleman's hands clenched on his knees. "What was the name of this school?" "Riverside Industrial School. In Pennsylvania. Might as well have been on the moon." Nailnish's voice stayed level, but something flickered in his eyes. Father Benedict ran it like it was his own little kingdom. He had rules for everything. How to walk, how to sit, how to eat, how to think. What happened if you broke the rules? Depends on which rule. Nailnish pulled his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around them. If you spoke Apache, you got the strap. If you try to practice any of the old ways, you got the box. If you try to run, he touched his wrists again. You got the chains. Coleman felt sick. "How long were you chained?" "The first time?" 3 days. I was trying to teach some of the younger children our names for things. The stars, the animals, the plants. Father Benedict said I was poisoning their minds with heathen nonsense. The first time, there were others. Any time they thought we were being too Indian. Sometimes they'd chain us just to remind us who was in charge." Nailnish's voice got quieter. "After a while, you learn to be very careful about what you remember out loud." The creek bubbled over the stones, a sound that should have been peaceful but now seemed to Coleman like whispered secrets, like confessions carried on moving water. "How did you get away?" Nailnish smiled then, the first real smile Coleman had seen from him. It transformed his face, made him look his age for just a moment. "There was a girl there, Ayana. She was Navajo, older than me. She'd been there 6 years, and she still remembered everything. Her language, her songs, even the stories her grandmother told her. She taught me that remembering wasn't betraying anything. It was the only way to stay alive inside your own skin." "What happened to her?" The smile faded. "She got sick. Lung fever. They put her in the infirmary and wouldn't let any of us see her. She died calling for her mother in Navajo. Father Benedict said it proved she never learned to be civilized." Coleman felt something break inside him, something that had been holding back a flood of rage and grief. "Jesus Christ. Ayana taught me something before she died," Nailnish continued. "She said the only way to beat them was to escape not just with your body, but with your spirit intact. She'd been planning it for 2 years. Had maps hidden, knew which guards drank too much, knew which doors stayed unlocked. You used her plan? I waited 6 months after she died. Had to make sure they thought I was broken. Had to make them think I'd given up on being Apache." Nailnish's hands moved to his ankles now, rubbing the scars there. "The night I left, I broke the chains with a piece of iron she'd hidden under her mattress. Cut me up pretty bad, but it was worth it to feel them fall away." "How far did you get before they noticed?" 2 days. But I knew the country better than they thought. My father had taught me to read the land, to find water, to move without leaving tracks. They sent dogs after me, but I knew how to lose them." Coleman pictured it. A boy alone in the wilderness, bleeding from fresh cuts on his wrists and ankles, carrying nothing but whatever he could steal and whatever his grandmother had taught him about survival. 300 miles, he said quietly. Maybe more. I didn't travel straight. Had to avoid towns, had to stay away from roads. Lived on what I could find or catch. Ate grasshoppers and cactus fruit, and anything else that wouldn't kill me." Nailnish looked at his scarred feet. "Took me 4 months. And you've been walking ever since?" "Looking for my people. But everything's different now. The places I remember are empty or full of white settlers, or turn into something else. Sometimes I think maybe I'm the only one left who remembers the way things were." Coleman watched the boy's face as he spoke, saw the weight of carrying so much loss alone. "Your family?" "Don't know. The soldiers scattered us to different schools, different places. My sister went to a school in Oklahoma. My little brother to one in Kansas. My parents." He shrugged. "They might be on a reservation somewhere. Might be dead. Might have forgotten they ever had children." The sun climbed higher, warming their faces and glinting off the moving water. Coleman found himself thinking about his own life, his comfortable routines, his certainties about right and wrong. All of it seemed suddenly fragile, built on assumptions he had never thought to question. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Nailnish looked at him with eyes that seemed to hold all the distance he had traveled, all the nights he had slept on hard ground, all the mornings he had woken up to find himself still alone. "Because yesterday you looked at my scars and got angry. Not at me, but for me. Most people either look away or ask if I deserved it." He pulled his feet from the water and began to put his moccasins back on, wincing as the leather touched his wounds. "And because I think maybe you're trying to decide whether to turn me in." Coleman felt the truth of it hit him like a fist to the stomach. The boy was right. All night, part of him had been thinking about his duty as a sheriff, about the law, about what would happen if word got out that he had harbored a runaway from a government school. "Are you?" Nailnish asked quietly. Coleman looked at this boy who had walked 300 miles to find a home that might not exist anymore, who carried scars like jewelry and spoke 2 languages with equal pain. He thought about chains on small wrists and children dying far from their mothers and all the laws that had made these things not just possible, but required. "No," he said, and felt something shift inside him, like a dam giving way. "No, I'm not going to turn you in." Nailnish nodded as if he had expected this answer, but Coleman saw relief flicker across his face like sunlight on water. "What are you going to do then?" Coleman stood up, his decision settling into his bones like the weight of new responsibility. I'm going to help you find your way home. Coleman went home that morning and took his badge off for the first time in 15 years. He held the star-shaped piece of tin in his palm, feeling its familiar weight, then set it on his kitchen table next to his coffee cup and the letter that had arrived on yesterday's stage. The letter was from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It described a runaway from Riverside Industrial School, a dangerous Apache boy who might be armed and should be considered hostile. There was a reward offered for his return, enough money to feed a family for months. Coleman struck a match and held it to the corner of the letter. The paper caught quickly, curling and blackening until only ash remained. He swept the ash into his palm and threw it out the window, watching it scatter on the morning wind. Then he packed his saddlebags with jerky, hardtack, and medical supplies. He cleaned his rifle and checked his ammunition. He filled his canteens and rolled his blankets tight. When he was finished, he looked around the little house that had been home for so many years and wondered if he would ever see it again. He found Nailnish where he had left him, sitting by the creek with his feet in the water. The boy looked up when Coleman approached, leading his horse and a smaller mare he'd borrowed from the livery stable. "You sure about this?" Nailnish asked. "No," Coleman said honestly, "but I'm sure about what happens if I don't." Nailnish stood slowly, favoring his injured feet. "Those men who are looking for me, they'll come here eventually. I know. They'll ask questions. People will remember seeing us together. I know that too." Nailnish studied Coleman's face, looking for something. You could lose everything. Coleman thought about his badge on the kitchen table, about the comfortable life he was leaving behind, about all the safe choices he could still make. Then he looked at this boy who had walked 300 miles with chain scars on his wrists, and he knew that some things were worth losing everything for. "Let's go," he said. They rode south through country that grew wilder with each mile. The neat farms and small towns of Coleman's territory gave way to open range, then to desert that stretched toward mountains blue with distance. Nailnish sat his horse like he had been born to it, despite his injured feet. He said little as they traveled, but Coleman noticed how his posture changed as they moved away from civilization. The careful wariness began to ease from his shoulders, and something else took its place, something that looked like remembering. On the second day, they stopped to rest in the shade of a rock outcrop. Nailnish dismounted and walked to a small barrel cactus growing nearby. He broke off a piece with his knife, careful of the spines, and scraped out the pulp inside. "Here," he said, offering some to Coleman. "It's bitter, but it helps with thirst." Coleman tasted it and made a face. Nailnish smiled at his expression. The first time Coleman had seen him look truly young. "My father taught me that," Nailnish said, eating his own portion without flinching. "He said the desert gives you everything you need if you know how to ask." "What else did he teach you?" Nailnish looked around at the harsh landscape, and Coleman saw something shift in his face, like a door opening after being locked for years. Which plants heal cuts. How to find water by watching birds. How to read tracks, so old they're just memories in the dust. He pointed to a distant ridge. "He taught me that mountain has 3 names, depending on what time of year you see it and what you need from it." As they traveled deeper into Apache country, Coleman watched Nailnish transform. The boy who had spoken careful English in the trading post began to use words Coleman didn't recognize, names for plants and animals and places that had no translation. Sometimes he would stop his horse suddenly and stare at some unremarkable piece of ground, his face tight with concentration. "I remember this place," he said once, looking at a dry wash that looked like every other dry wash to Coleman. "We camped here when I was small. There's a spring hidden in those rocks, and my grandmother made soup from the roots that grow near it." They found the spring exactly where Nailnish said it would be, water bubbling up from deep in the earth, clear and cold and sweet. Nailnish knelt beside it and cupped water in his hands, drinking deeply before splashing some on his face. "She told me stories here," he said quietly, "about Coyote and the stars, about how the world began, about the first fire." His voice grew softer. "I thought I had forgotten them all." That night, as they sat around their small campfire, Nailnish began to hum. It was a sound Coleman had never heard before, low and rhythmic, like wind through canyon walls or water over stones. The boy's eyes were closed, and his face looked peaceful in the firelight. "What is that?" Coleman asked when the humming stopped. "A song my mother used to sing when she was grinding corn. I haven't remembered it in years." Nailnish looked up at the stars scattered across the desert sky. "It's about being grateful for what the earth gives you, even when it seems like nothing." On the third day, they found the riders following them. Coleman spotted the dust cloud first, a brown smudge against the blue sky, too large and too persistent to be anything but men on horseback. He reined in his horse and pulled out his field glasses, adjusting the focus until he could make out individual figures. 6 men, riding hard, with something official in the way they sat their horses. Even at this distance, Coleman could see the glint of badges on their chests. "How far back?" Nailnish asked. He had noticed Coleman's stillness and was already reaching for his water canteen, preparing to ride harder. "Half a day, maybe less. They're pushing their horses pretty hard." Nailnish looked back at the dust cloud, then ahead at the rough country they would have to cross. "We can't outrun them on this terrain. Not with the horses carrying double loads." Coleman studied the land around them, looking for defensible positions, places to make a stand if it came to that. But he was one man with a rifle against 6, and Nailnish was just a boy, no matter how much wilderness wisdom he carried. "There's another way," Nailnish said quietly. Coleman looked at him. "What do you mean? You could leave me. Ride back and tell them you never saw me. Say you were just out hunting or checking on some ranch hands. They believe you." The suggestion hung in the hot air between them like a challenge. Coleman felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest, something that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the look in Nailnish's eyes when he talked about his grandmother's stories. "No," Coleman said. "They'll arrest you. Maybe worse. That reward money makes men do stupid things." I said no. Nailnish studied his face for a long moment. "Why?" Coleman thought about all the easy answers he could give, all the noble words about justice and doing right. But looking at this boy who had survived things that would have broken most men, he knew that only the truth would do. Because 20 years ago, I took an oath to protect and serve. I thought that meant following orders and keeping the peace. But maybe it means something different than I thought. They rode harder after that, pushing the horses as much as they dared over ground that grew rockier and more treacherous with each mile. The dust cloud behind them grew steadily larger, and Coleman could feel time running out like sand through an hourglass. As the sun began to set, painting the desert the color of old blood, Nailnish suddenly straightened in his saddle. "There," he said, pointing to a gap between 2 red stone pillars. "That's the way home." Coleman looked where he was pointing and saw nothing but more desert, more rocks, more empty sky. But there was something in Nailnish's voice, a certainty that cut through doubt like a blade. "How do you know?" "Because that's what my grandmother taught me to find the first star. She said when you see it between those rocks, you know you're close to where you belong." As if summoned by his words, the first star appeared in the darkening sky, framed perfectly between the stone pillars. Nailnish sat straighter, and Coleman could see years falling away from his face, could see the boy he had been before the chains, before the school, before everything that had tried to break him. "Almost home," Nailnish whispered, and for the first time since Coleman had met him, his voice carried something that sounded like hope. Behind them, the dust cloud was close enough now that Coleman could hear the distant sound of hoofbeats on stone. 6 men with badges and guns and certainties about right and wrong that Coleman had once shared. But ahead of them lay something different, something that couldn't be measured in laws or rewards or official documents. Ahead lay the possibility that some kinds of freedom were worth any price, and some journeys home were worth whatever it cost to take them. Coleman checked his rifle one more time and spurred his horse toward the gap between the stones, following a boy who was finally remembering his real name toward a home that might not exist anymore, pursued by men who believed they were doing the right thing. In the gathering darkness, with the first stars beginning to shine, Sheriff Coleman discovered that the hardest part of doing right wasn't figuring out what it was It was finding the courage to see it through to the end. They rode through the gap between the stone pillars just as the moon rose, painting the desert silver and black. On the other side lay a hidden valley that seemed to exist outside of time, where ancient cottonwoods grew along a stream that sang over smooth rocks, and the air smelled of sage and something else, something that made Nailnish sit straighter in his saddle. "Smoke," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Juniper smoke. Coleman could smell it too now. The sweet scent of burning would carried on the night breeze. Somewhere in this valley, someone was tending a fire, someone was home. They followed the stream deeper into the valley, their horses' hooves silent on the soft earth. The sound of pursuit had faded behind them, lost in the maze of canyons and false trails that protected this hidden place. Here, surrounded by towering red walls that caught and held the moonlight, Coleman felt like they had stepped into a different world entirely. The camp appeared gradually, like something emerging from a dream. First, a few hide shelters tucked among the trees. Then the glow of a fire, low and carefully banked. Then figures moving in the shadows, people who had heard the horses coming and were deciding whether to welcome or hide. An old woman stepped into the moonlight, and Coleman felt Nailnish go rigid beside him. She was small and bent with age, her white hair braided with strips of leather and turquoise beads. Her face was mapped with wrinkles that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure, and her eyes, even in the dim light, Coleman could see that her eyes held the same depth as Nailnish's, the same ancient knowing. "Shemis Sani," Nailnish whispered, and Coleman heard his voice break like a boy's voice should. The old woman took a step forward, peering at them through the darkness. When she spoke, it was in Apache, words that flowed like water over stones, like wind through pine trees, like all the sounds Coleman had never learned to make. Nailnish slid from his horse and walked toward her on legs that seemed uncertain, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. He spoke back to her in the same musical language, and Coleman heard years of careful English dissolve into something older, something that belonged to this valley and these people and the smoke that rose from sacred fires. The old woman reached out and touched Nailnish's face with hands that trembled slightly, as if she were handling something precious and fragile. Then she pulled him against her chest and held him, and Coleman saw her shoulders shake with silent sobs. Other figures emerged from the shadows. Men and women, some old, some young, all of them carrying the same careful wariness that Coleman had first seen in Nailnish. But as they recognized the boy in the old woman's arms, their faces transformed. Children appeared, peeking out from behind their mother's skirts. An old man with a limp came forward, using a walking stick car from juniper wood. They spoke in Apache, voices overlapping like a song Coleman couldn't understand, but felt in his chest anyway. They touched Nailnish's face, his hands, his hair, as if they needed to confirm he was real, that he had truly come back to them. The old woman, Shemis Sani, his grandmother, finally released him and looked up at Coleman, still sitting on his horse. She said something in Apache, and Nailnish turned to translate. "She wants to know if you're the one who brought me home." Coleman dismounted, suddenly aware that he was an outsider here, a representative of the world that had taken this boy away from these people. But when he looked into the old woman's eyes, he saw not suspicion, but something that might have been gratitude. "Tell her I only helped him remember the way," Coleman said. He already knew how to get here. Nailnish translated, and the old woman smiled. She spoke again, longer this time, her voice carrying the cadence of someone used to telling stories around fires. "She says you are welcome at our fire," Nailnish said. "She says any man who helps a lost child find his way home is a friend to our family." They were led to the fire at the center of the camp, where other people gathered in a circle that seemed to expand naturally to include them. The old woman ladled soup from a pot hanging over the coals, and Coleman tasted something rich and complex made from things that grew wild in this desert country. As they ate, Nailnish spoke quietly with his grandmother, their conversation flowing between Apache and English like a river, finding its natural course. Coleman caught fragments, questions about family, about where he had been, about the scars on his wrist that she traced with gentle fingers. The old man with the walking stick leaned over and spoke to Coleman in careful English. "You are a lawman," he said. It was not a question. Coleman looked down at his chest, where his badge had been for so many years. "I was. And now?" Coleman considered this. "Now I'm not sure what I am." The old man nodded as if this answer made perfect sense. "My name is Goyle. In English, they would call me Jerome. I have been many things in my life: warrior, prisoner, farmer, grandfather. Sometimes what we are changes when we least expect it. Were you at the boarding schools too?" Goyle shook his head. "I was lucky. I was too old when they came for the children. But I have seen what those places do. I have held grandchildren who flinched when I tried to touch them, who had forgotten how to laugh, who spoke only in the language of their captors." He looked across the fire at Nailnish, who was showing his grandmother something carved from a piece of wood. "This one is different. This one remembered how to come home." Coleman watched Nailnish with his family, saw how the careful stiffness left his posture, how his voice became musical when he spoke his own language, how his grandmother's songs seemed to call back pieces of himself that had been buried for years. "How many others are there like him?" Coleman asked. "Too many," Goyle said simply. "Children scattered to schools across the country, families broken apart, languages dying with each generation. The government says it is for our own good, but we know what it really is." As the night grew deeper, the old woman began to sing. Her voice was cracked with age, but still strong, carrying melodies that seemed to have grown from this very ground. Other voices joined hers, creating harmonies that rose with the smoke toward the stars. Nailnish sang too, tentatively at first, as if testing whether he still remembered how. But gradually his voice grew stronger, adding threads to the musical tapestry that wrapped around Coleman like a blanket made of sound. Coleman had heard church hymns and saloon songs, military marches and funeral dirges, but he had never heard music like this. Music that seemed to be part of the earth itself, that connected the people singing it to something larger and older and more permanent than any law or government or badge. When the singing ended, the old woman spoke to Coleman directly, her English careful but clear. "Tomorrow, men will come looking," she said. "Men with badges and guns and papers that say they have the right to take our children again." Coleman nodded. He had known this moment would come. "What will you do?" "What we have always done. We will disappear. We will take the children and go deeper into the desert, to places those men cannot follow. We will survive." "And Nailnish?" She looked across the dying fire at her grandson, who was showing some of the younger children how to make shadow animals with their hands. "He is home now. He remembers who he is. That is all an old woman can ask for." Coleman felt something settle in his chest, a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "I should go." "Yes," she said gently, "but know that you will always have a place at our fire. You brought back something precious to us. That makes you family." Coleman stood and gathered his things, preparing for the ride back to whatever waited for him in the world outside this valley. Nailnish came over as he was saddling his horse. "You don't have to go back," the boy said. "You could stay here. My people know how to disappear, how to live free." Coleman looked around at the camp, at these people who had preserved something essential despite everything that had been done to destroy it. For a moment, he was tempted, but he knew that his path lay in a different direction. "I have to face what's coming," he said. "But thank you for showing me what's worth facing it for." Nailnish held out his hand, and Coleman shook it, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of everything this boy had survived. "Will I see you again?" Nailnish asked. "I don't know," Coleman said honestly, "but I'll remember you. I'll remember all of this." As Coleman rode away from the valley, following the stream back toward the gap in the stones, he heard the old woman singing again. The sound followed him for miles, weaving through the canyons and echoing off the red rock walls, carrying stories he was only beginning to understand. When he finally emerged from Apache country 3 days later, he found the federal agents waiting for him at a water hole 20 miles from Clearwater. 6 men with dusty clothes and hard faces and questions they wanted answers to. Their leader, a marshal named Williams, rode up as Coleman approached the water. "Sheriff Coleman, we've been looking for you. I figured you might be. You seen anything of that Apache boy we're tracking? Goes by the name Joseph." Coleman looked Williams in the eye and felt something calm and sure settle in his chest. "No," he said. "Haven't seen any Apache boys." It was not exactly a lie. The frightened child in chains who had answered to Joseph no longer existed. In his place was Nailnish, surrounded by family, singing the old songs home. Williams studied Coleman's face, looking for signs of deception. "You sure about that? We had reliable information he was in your area." "I'm sure," Coleman said, and he was surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "I've been out checking on some ranch hands. Nothing unusual to report." The marshal watched him for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "Well, if you do see anything, you know your duty." As Coleman rode toward Clearwater, he thought about duty and law and the difference between what was legal and what was right. He thought about a boy who had walked 300 miles to find his way home, and an old woman who still kept the old songs alive and the sound of voices raised in harmony under desert stars. When he reached town, he would turn in his badge officially. He would face whatever consequences came from the choices he had made. But he would do it knowing that sometimes the most important laws were the ones written not in books, but in the human heart. Laws about protecting the innocent, about helping the lost find their way home, about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. As the sun set behind him, painting the sky the colors of fire and blood, Coleman rode toward an uncertain future, carrying the certainty that he had finally learned what it really meant to serve and protect. And in the growing darkness, if he listened carefully, he could still hear the echo of ancient songs, carrying on the desert wind like prayers made of music and memory.